have with us today Imre Szeman. He is Canada Research Chair in Cultural Studies and Professor of English, Film Studies, and Sociology at the University of Alberta. He conducts research on and teaches in the areas of energy and environmental studies, social and cultural theory, globalization and nationalism, and Canadian studies. Current projects include a book on the cultural politics of oil, an edited collection on energy, history, and politics, and a major companion to critical and cultural theory. Dominic, as I think everybody knows, is the director of CENHS and a professor of anthropology at Rice University. He is the author of 3 books, all of which treat the subject of media, social theory, and the role of intellectuals in contemporary society. And he has conducted research in several contexts, including Germany, Iceland, and Mexico. His latest ethnographic work considers transitions to renewable energy in Oaxaca, Mexico, and the energopolitical processes that underlie them. So please join me in welcoming them both.
Thank you so much. It's nice to be able to move from harried, anxious host mode to sort of relaxed presenter mode. So thank you all. So this panel has gone through a few different iterations. At first, because Imre and I have been working together recently on sort of promoting energy humanities as a thing, right, where it didn't used to be a thing. And that both has intellectual, purely scholarly intellectual reasons, which is just the importance of bringing the humanities and social sciences and arts into energy studies, but also creating, forums like this where we can actually get together and share and deepen our sort of transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary conversations and learn things, learn new methods, ideas, questions, and so forth. So that was iteration 1, but then we both kind of got interested in various paper topics, and Imre had one that was sort of gearing towards aesthetics and power, and I had one that was aesthetics, affect, and power. But coming so late in the program and also not having quite as much time as the other panels, we looked at sort of what had already been discussed at some length, and aesthetics and affect sort of got struck off a little bit, giving us the power, which we thought has been sort of in waiting in the wings in many of the panels and many of the discussions. But we thought it would be nice to move it center stage and sort of make sort of another to kind of prompt a discussion on power by putting together some thoughts, both of which were connected to the original papers we were going to give and some additional thoughts as well. So we're each going to speak for about 15 minutes and then open to the floor. And Imre will begin.
So when Dominic says we're not harried, that's a lie, since this is kind of invented on the spot. I think I've been very, very taken and intrigued and interested in all of the presentations that have been made over the last couple of days. And I think all of us can see some themes emerging that get repeated over and over again. And one of them has to do with this need for communication, this need for the ideas that we want to put into play with respect to energy, the kinds of our addition of energy to the fields that we have been investigating, interested in anyway. We feel not just a need to analyze, I think, but also to be perhaps didactic a little bit. Perhaps we want this to have some bite. We don't just want to do some analysis on how significant energy is to thinking about history, or how significant it is for how we reconceptualize the environment, and leave it at that. So there's a kind of a politics to it all the time. I think, though, that what I have felt lacking a little bit, and something that I would like them to try to add in my 15 minutes, is a more directed discussion of perhaps power. And perhaps the question that I'd like to kind of pose in a sense is how and why we might enable that change to take place, other than the way that I think it's kind of been emerging over and over again. You can say that I'm wrong, of course, and that may be the case, but I do think that what I haven't seen being discussed are concepts like capitalism or property, or the kinds of the general systems within which the types of analyses that we'd like to do about the environment, and also the kinds of changes that we'd like to bring about, might happen. So I always kind of have this sense that we're speaking back to existing systems of power, that we have ideas that, whether they're articulated or not, we expect kind of existing state systems to make changes. We're kind of making some claims on them rather indirectly, but it kind of emerges in the way that we're structuring our our papers, and I'd like to kind of make two interventions, or I want to put out two areas. Well, that's wrong. I'm going to talk about one intervention into energy and power that I've done in conjunction with Dominic, and then the other thing, if I have time, I'm going to read is something more like a manifesto, and I thought I would do that at the end because it's at the end, I suppose. So the first thing I want to talk about is something that I've been really interested in and trying to work on, and that's trying to think about the ways in which energy and oil specifically fit into existing analyses and existing social theories. It seems to me that the major social theories of modernity, starting from Marx to the present, don't thematize energy much, if at all. Marx, when he was writing Capital, was already at a moment past the invention or the modern discovery of oil in Titusville, Pennsylvania. Couldn't have possibly had a sense of how that might operate within capital, but to write a major theory of capital without a good sense of how energy might fit into it, other than labor power, seems to me to be an absence. Especially when for Marx at least, kind of the utopian element that emerges out of capital is potentially the kind of coming into being of a society where machines do all the work and we don't have to do any of it, and that seems to require some kind of theory of how power works, especially oil and energy. So there's a kind of the way in which in particular for Marx, from the Grundrisse, the fragment on machines has been reactivated in theories of autonomia, for instance. It seems to me that without some kind of analyses or understanding of power and of energy, you are lacking something in those social theories. And one of the things I've been trying to do in this book that I'm working on is kind of remap social theory from Marx to the present, with trying to see what would happen if you add energy into it, to see if it would still be productive, to see what kinds of things you could generate from it, what kind of absences you get when you try to add that to it, not just to interrupt their particular theories of the social, but also to kind of reframe how we might imagine the kinds of demands that we try to make through our work on behalf of the environment. So the first thing I kind of want to talk about is my attempt to do this in response to Foucault's theories of power. And this was something that I got the chance to do when I was invited by Dominic to respond to a series of essays in a forthcoming, I guess in the next issue of Anthropological Quarterly, where a number of contributors were doing field work, looking at energy in relationship to state power. And Dominic made this provocation in his introduction to that special issue. He put forward a concept called Energopolitics, or Energopower. And the basic idea, I just want to make sure to get his words right, are that Energopolitics offers an alternative genealogy of modern power that rethinks political power through the analytics of energy and fuel. So it's kind of a way to take Foucault's theories and add power to them and see what comes out as a result. Now, it seems to me that that's really important for the same reasons that it's significant to look at the ways in which power has been theorized throughout modernity, because it gives us a different idea of what those dynamics of power might look like. So it might change how we think about state power. But one of the things when I was responding to these essays that I started to learn about in relation to Foucault is that there's something that is important about I guess just to kind of put it bluntly, it's the issue here is not to say do we get a better model of state power if we add energy to it. I think we do that. It's to think about if those of us here think energy is really, really important to how power operates. It may also be the case that if we take Foucault's analysis of state power to be significant, important, productive, that absence is not just an absence in Foucault, but an absence in the operations of state power more generally. We do know that states, of course, are very, very anxious and interested in the function of energy, the importance of energy for their populations. It may well be, though, that the dominant dispositifs, disciplinary mechanisms of power which in the late Foucault at least are organized around populations, just doesn't have very much function, actually. Biopolitics, as operates through states, doesn't really think about power that much. It doesn't think about energy. I have to be careful here about power and energy. It doesn't think about energy. But it also then tells us something very, very interesting. To me, at least, it did. That when I was looking at these essays and trying to think about more directly about Foucault and energy, and kind of reminded myself of a couple of things. One is that the late Foucault surprises himself. He's very direct about this. That power, as he understands it, is always organized in relation to the state, which I don't think is necessarily how we might think of Foucault. But Foucault, he says, I can't believe I'm giving these lectures and I realize I've become a theorist of the state. The state is where I think all power is organized. And where I think it specifically is interested in, where I think that power takes place with populations. So when I was thinking about this, it seemed to me that a couple of things. One of the kind of limits that we continue to run up against as thinkers of energy and thinkers of the environment is that we're always curious as to why states don't act on the demands that are made by climate scientists, by groups like the IPCC, by work such as ours. And the more and more I was looking at this, it just seemed to me that one of the amazing limits that we might be running into is that states are very good at thinking about populations, and they're very poor about thinking about the globe, or they're very poor about thinking about species, or very poor about thinking about life in itself. When we have a kind of a breakdown of politics as happened at Copenhagen, we tend to blame, we tend to put the blame on states, which is where it should be, of course. But we might also recognize that if one takes Foucault's model of governmental power to be largely correct, or at least productive, which I certainly do, I think it describes the nature of contemporary neoliberalism. It also tells us something about why those neoliberal states have an incredible difficulty reacting to environmental crisis, even if it might be in their interests. They don't know how to think about species, they know how to think about populations, and they know how to think about state populations. And one of the things that I kind of wanted to conclude from that paper is just the following, which I'll just read out from my section, from what I wrote at the end of this piece. It seems to me that one of the desires that underwrites environmentalism, it may well be that biopolitics doesn't enter into our hopes. A biopolitics organized in relationship to species or life itself, that's one of the hopes that underwrites environmentalism. A hope for a system of political management that incorporates the environment and energy into its calculations of the health of large groups of creatures, the creatures under the charge of states. It may well be that this in the end is the wrong desire, or one that sets itself up for disappointment because it fails to grasp the limits of biopolitics and the need for a different form of political organization that begins at the level of the planetary rather than hoping to adapt existing states' systems to it. So let me just say that again. I think a lot of the desires that we are expressing when we do environmental work is that we're actually expecting existing systems to adapt to the demands made by environmentalists. And I think that if those state systems operate on the logics of populations, the logics of biopolitics, that demand is always going to disappoint us. And what I would suggest is that the kind of demand that we should be putting out there is a demand for a very different mode of power, which is one that, again, begins at the level of the planetary rather than expecting to adapt existing state systems to it. I just don't see very much hope in the capacity of existing states, even in their own best interests, sometimes, to adapt their systems to take into account more than their own populations. So given that, what might such a planetary system be? And I thought it would be I don't know if I have another 5 minutes. Okay. I thought it would be a little bit, I thought it'd be wimping out not to say something about that, and I also think that what can one possibly say about that except to kind of articulate some kind of utopian impulse to some different kind of system, and yet I think I also didn't hear that kind of articulation, and I think that's incredibly significant and incredibly important. Something I talked to Judy about in her work. And so I'm just going to do that a little bit and explain what it might be in a kind of a little bit of a manifesto-y way, perhaps, or a way I thought that was appropriate to being on the last panel. What might it be to begin at the planetary rather than hoping through our systems, through our criticisms, to adapt existing state systems to the outputs that we want, to the way that we want it to be. So here it goes. This is the coda to the paper I didn't get to read because our session was too short. The Commons. The Commons is a term that insists on the fundamentally shared character of social life. That everything from language to education, from nature to our genetic inheritance, from images to knowledge belongs irreducibly to us, to all of us. The Commons seems to me to be not only a key to the present, but it seems also to be one of the basic founding principles of the political. The philosopher Jacques Rancière argues, for instance, that equality is not something to be slowly worked towards in successive phases, which is the mode of politics understood in most liberal visions of politics. But rather, equality is the fundamental principle from which politics has to begin. We are, in other words, already equal. And if this is not the case, it points to failings of our social and political system that have to be addressed immediately, not something that is worked out over time. And it seems to me that commons are fundamental to the political in just this way. Why we do not share life in common, but are divided up and split apart. Why our common production is owned by a few and not by the many is a matter of history, of course. It's also a situation whose perpetuation requires an argument, some claim for why we live apart and not in common, in the way that the concept would demand of us. And there are arguments, of course, as to why we don't live in common, against the common. And the most famous of such arguments, one that is probably a motto now of the neoliberal age, is Friedrich Hayek's claim that the only way to protect radical egalitarianism and individual rights in the face of state violence is, in his words, to install inviolable private property rights at the heart of the social order, end quote. Hayek's work has played an important role in defining the guiding ethos of neoliberalism. But there's an even more recent claim and a more influential claim about the commons that has been repeatedly used to argue for its impossibility. Garrett Hardin's 1968 essay, The Tragedy of the Commons. So I have to thank Noah here for putting this in my mind. Since its first publication, this has become a widely anthologized and cited text that has been used to justify the privatization of land and other social services, and more generally to make the cause for the rationality of private property and the irrationality of every other system. Hardin's argument is simple. Communities that share resources end up with nothing. Instead of wealth for all, there's wealth for none. The basis for this claim is a hypothetical case involving the commons as they exist in rural England. Hardin asks, just to get to the point, what if a herdsman who makes use of the commons wants to expand his herd? The rational herdsman, he supposes, will add another animal, since the cost of additional grazing, reduced food for the commons, soil depletion, etc., is borne by all who use the common, while the benefits accrue to him alone. Since every herdsman will rationally act in the same way, the commons will become so overstocked as to eventually become used up, leaving nothing for everyone. If the herdsman owned the property, instead of sharing it in common, if the herdsman owned the property he used for his herd, this would not happen, Hardin argues, since each would want to make sure that they maximize production and that their land was not damaged or destroyed. Despite having become the dominant paradigm through which social scientists have come to assess natural resource issues, this according actually to a recent World Bank discussion paper, the environmentalist Ian Angus has pointed out that there is in fact no evidence to support Hardin's claims as to what would happen to the shared commons. Hardin simply ignored what actually happens in a real commons, Angus writes. Self-regulation by the communities involved. In the real world, small farmers, fishers, and others have created their own institutions and rules for preserving resources and ensuring that the commons community survive through good years and bad, end quote. The assumption driving Hardin's analysis is that human nature is fundamentally selfish. The centuries of community usage of common lands for the benefit of all involved would seem to suggest otherwise. And why, for that matter, would the herdsman want to increase the size of his herd in the first place? Angus writes, another quote, Pardon didn't describe the behavior of herdsmen in pre-capitalist farming communities. He described the behavior of capitalists operating in a capitalist economy, end quote. Not only does Hardin fail to offer a reason why the commons couldn't or wouldn't work, he also offers no evidence that privatization would do a better job of preserving the land. Indeed, the damage wrought to the environment by all manner of capitalist enterprises might give us cause to think the very opposite was true. Nevertheless, the tragedy of the commons continues to be appealed to as a landmark argument for the benefit of private over public, a useful myth supporting the politics of the World Bank, IMF, and national governments in their ongoing project of the enclosure of the commons and the privatization of public property. So this session is about impasses and openings. Our aesthetic, philosophical, and political interventions into oil modernity bite deeply when they remind us of the degree to which we have all become oil subjects. But they bite more deeply if they were also to forcefully challenge the liberal model of growth and change, which is dependent on oil, which can never be achieved on the terms it sets itself, and which is a key part of the reason for the despair and paralysis that can often accompany the politics of the environment. Oil may be close to unrepresentable, its scale and scope define any clear map, but it's also an imminently intuitable material entity. And in addition to all of the other things it produces and creates, its finite material universality demands, to me it seems at least, a philosophy of the commons. When we worry about rising CO2 levels, what we are worrying about is its impact on the commons. And yet, this is a commons whose character and nature we have, for the most part, left under-articulated or even unspoken. Despite the enormity of the challenges facing us, and despite its too frequent descent into dystopianism, it can be easier to devote attention to the environment than it can be to making claims and demands on the commons we want. There remains a concession in too much of our thinking, and I'm guilty of this as well, to the inevitable and seeming inviolable law of property. Yet, what is nature, however speculatively or problematically invoked? What is it but that which cannot be reduced to private property? In bringing oil and energy to the surface of our critical investigations, we need to be careful to not at the same time push the energies and logics of capitalism into the spaces in the earth from whence the black stuff came. Thanks.
That was great. Thank you. So I guess I will pick up on some of those themes, maybe reiterate them and take them in a slightly different direction. I'll start where you started with sort of Energopower, which for me was part of, in my field, anthropology. Dominant models of political power these days are really shaped by Foucault's notion of biopower, with its two poles, one the kind of care of the self and the other the management of the population. And I was really, you have these books that you read that sort of have, where something snaps into place, and one of those books, or actually the article, was Tim Mitchell's Carbon Democracy, which I was reading about the same time I was reading the German renewable energy visionary and politician Hermann Scheer's work on the solar economy. Was the book I was reading at the same time. The two projects in different ways tie the intimacies of political power together with material organizations of energy in really compelling ways. Probably some of you are undoubtedly familiar with the books, so I don't want to go into great detail about them, but in a nutshell, what Mitchell argues is that all the wonders of social democracy that we have come to enjoy in the 19th, but principally in the 20th century, had to do in some ways with the materiality of coal, and with the way that coal was moved, and with the fact that coal miners could exert incredible political pressure on states and corporations to take their demands into account, and that all of the major victories that sort of paved the way towards social democratic institutions were in one way or another connected with coal strikes, and that when we shifted from a coal-based fossil fuel economy to an oil-based fossil fuel economy in the 20th century, that was when these things began to weaken, because it was difficult to have the same sort of labor politics when you got into transoceanic shipping in international markets as you did when you were dealing with heavy sort of rail-bound coal. Hermann Scheer's argument is a little different, but connects the sort of length of supply chains to the sort of kinds of democratic citizenship that are possible in very interesting ways. And so that led me to sort of think about whether there was not also a kind of general analytic category that we could think about that would connect sort of fuel and electricity, especially to sort of conditions of possibility for political power, things that aren't seen, things that are linked to particular infrastructures. And that sort of was what prompted this motivation of sort of speaking energy to biopower, speaking energy to sort of contemporary understandings of political power. And I thought it's an interesting project, but it's also sort of we were talking yesterday in the Affect panel about sort of hope and despair, and this is, I think, also to think in terms of Energopower sort of leads you into the space of despair, because it's really about how the stored energy of infrastructure will tend, under most circumstances, to reproduce the political status quo. So it's really a story about path dependency and those of us who went to the ship channel on the little tour, and those who didn't really should, and you get to see the scale of the infrastructure that's there, and the kind of people who inhabit that infrastructure, and we met some of them, and the sort of ideologies that they have, you begin to realize the scale of what you're up against. And so that pushes you into the situation again, as you said, of what is to be done, what can be done. And because that theme has been sort of hovering over our discussions, I thought it was, we could talk about that. But I wanted to also, and this is sort of moving in parallel to the second half of Imre's comments too, to actually, we'll talk about a couple of things. One, there's a lot of work that can be done at the level of what I would call method of being, sort of subjective, ethical work that can be done along those lines. And, we've talked a little bit about the sort of, the recycling and those sorts of things, those kinds of practices and how they're important. But along those lines, if you're looking for sort of routes out of that condition of impasse, that sort of paralytic, I don't know how Amanda put it, she had a great term for that, sort of leaving us in the sort of despairing paralytic or something like that. Sorry, I'm misquoting, but that sense, which is something that hangs like a gloom over every time we sit together to have a discussion, and needs to be, addressed as it is in the oxygen of the room, so to speak. Since it hasn't been mentioned, I think one of those wonderful pieces, probably one of the most powerful pieces of energy humanities I've read in the past year was Royce Granton's piece in the New York Times about learning how to die in the Anthropocene. And if you haven't read it, you should. But the short version of it is, that, of course, that it's about coming to terms with the death of the civilization as a way of moving on. And that, I think, is a very powerful kind of a compass at one level. But then, if we're thinking about method of being, I think we also have to think intersubjectively. We have to think about relationality. We have to think about the forms of power and community that we're moving toward. And I really like this, I work on the comments that Imre is talking about. I think that's really important. And I just wanted to say, sort of in terms of my own work on energy, some of the most sort of interesting, inspiring things that have happened have come sort of from the circumstance of working, without really intending this to happen, we feel work in two places, as somebody said, in Mexico and Iceland at the same time, seeing two very different types of contexts, two very, one sort of developing state, another one is sort of fairly developed European state, but both of which are experiencing crises for different reasons that have energetic components to them. Seeing that there have been interestingly analogous, not exactly identical, but analogous kinds of political responses that I find very inspiring. And I'll just very briefly talk about those and then sort of close out and turn to Q&A. So Mexico, petrostate, where the state depends on oil sales for 40% of its operating budget. So every biopolitical project that the Mexican state is involved in ultimately can be traced back to sort of oil revenue at some level. But that oil revenue is falling rapidly. Heavy crude production in Mexico has dropped 25% in the past decade. And that's because their big field is running dry. And you've heard a little bit about all the sort of Mexican energy reform, and that's the push to sort of push out deeper into the Gulf. But one of the things that led to was a really ambitious campaign of clean electricity targets to sort of save oil for the less oil that's being used domestically can be sort of sold abroad. And that was part of what Dominic and I were studying there, was sort of the wind boom in Oaxaca, which is technically speaking some of the best wind in the world. But a lot of that land that they need to build these large wind parks is held by indigenous communities in a part of Mexico that's been long abandoned, frankly, by the governing state, where biopolitical interventions are scarcely to be seen. Healthcare centers, schools, that sort of thing. Infrastructure, we can't even say it's in ruins because in many cases it was never there. Intermittent electricity and so forth. And so the arguments that we were involved with studying, one of the things that was happening was a sort of new sort of alliance between indigenous communities that were opposed to renewable energy, which, you know, for us, when we first got there, if somebody wants to weigh into it, was sort of a tragic situation because, of course, we were thinking of the global good of, you know, the renewable energy transition, and the more megawatts of clean electricity we can get on the grid, the better. But from their point of view, it looked very different. Some of these activists were very sharp about noting that this clean electricity, so to speak, was going to go to build Walmarts, and it was going to bring a kind of consumer-oriented culture to this part of Mexico where that also had been, you know, fairly threadbare. And so the idea of clean electricity that was funding, that was empowering literally Walmarts, that was empowering Cemex, that was empowering FEMSA Heineken, that for them was nothing clean. There was nothing clean about it. So this movement was all about reasserting communal sovereignty, inventing traditions of communal sovereignty where they hadn't even existed. And it was about sort of, in a sense, taking back a certain kind of commons from the state and asserting sort of indigenous authority over state authority. So that was interesting and, you know, inspiring in some ways to see, even though, I guess, against the backdrop of sort of climate change, you could think of it as being something very dispiriting. And then Iceland, again, crisis of a different kind, not petroleum directly, but financial, where Iceland experienced the biggest banking collapse per capita in the history of the world in 2008. And out of that came a really profound delegitimation of the entire sort of mainstream political apparatus, where all the political parties were in one way or another involved with either the run-up to the banking bust or with trying to put Icelandic citizens on the hook for the bank's debt. Okay, so they didn't, and that created this sort of weird sort of gap where the first popular revolution following the collapse, I mean, before Tahrir, before Tunisia, before Occupy, really started in Iceland, and they call the pot and pan revolution. And out of that sort of gap, that vacuum, if you will, of sort of a legitimate party where everyone was very angry and upset, came this sort of very strange political experiment where this former comedian, satirist, actor, Jon and a group of his friends started this group called the Best Party, because they said, why would you vote for anyone but the best? And they came up with this absurdist political platform, like, you know, free towels for all the spas, Disneyland for the airport, a polar bear for the Reykjavik Zoo, and things like that. And people couldn't figure out, and everyone just dismissed them as, oh, this is another prank by our well-known satirist and prankster Jon. And it was really unclear, and what they did very skillfully was they played the lines between satire and sincerity, where you could never be entirely sure what it was that they were up to, but they did it really well. And in some ways, they came across as being much more sincere, even in their humor, in their sort of ludic form, than the people who were sort of earnestly pronouncing, we know how to bring back the jobs, we know how to do this, we're the responsible adults here, essentially. Much to the surprise of everyone in Iceland in the political establishment, the Best Party actually came out ahead in the election for the mayoral office in Reykjavik, and Jon became mayor. This happened, I guess, 2009, 2010, anyway. And, you know, installed themselves as the sort of governing party in a coalition with the Social Democrats. And what's really interesting about this is how that although they never gave up this sort of strange focus, and they described themselves as anarcho-surrealists, because they would give these very strange, odd speeches, and which were both incredibly, like, sort of far out there and hilarious, but also weirdly sincere and honest when it came to issues like, you know, it really is terrible to have to choose between the elderly and the young, but, you know, our budget has collapsed because of our tax revenues after the crash, and so we have to make cuts somewhat, that sort of thing. We hate to be in this situation. But we appreciate you understanding. And so they moved back between a sort of a ludic and a sort of, again, more sort of serious sort of form of politics, but actually got an incredible amount done. And what they were most proud of was the fact that they showed that when sort of citizens could take back the sort of rule of government, or the sort of operation of government from the sort of established political parties, that nothing collapsed. Things worked, because they knew how to ask for help, and they knew to put the most competent people into the jobs instead of their allies and so forth. So it's interesting, and though, anyway, these are very brief snapshots I can expand on if you're interested, but the core point is that although these movements in some ways couldn't be more different and happening in very different parts of the world in all sorts of different ways, they shared a lot of the same values, a sort of emphasis on sort of lateral connectivity over vertical formation, obviously a suspicion of the state, but interestingly, in the Icelandic case, they believed in the possibility of city-level governance, and they sort of began to work and align themselves with other cities with radical sort of democratic projects like Porto Alegre in Brazil, and to share information, and made a pretty compelling argument that there are things you can do at the level of the city that are actually quite important that you might not be able to translate up to the level of the state, but that's okay. You do what you can. You do this work at the level of the city, and you can still do a lot of good. Also a kind of sense of care, humility, were important values. And so I think, when I'm thinking about the type of, political orientations, the sort of projects that we might want to look to identify and to nurture, I think some of these values are very good ones to think about. Also in terms of addressing the issues of energy and climate change that we're facing here. I'd probably add to them, because in the Icelandic case, they have it less than in the Mexican case, a very strong use of feminism, because I think it's an antidote to so many poisons. But in general, I think their models are both in some ways successful and impactful in their own way at a small level, but that's the point, and that was sort of the final point I made in the paper, is that in this sort of world that Tim Morton has diagnosed as our kind of hyper-objective condition, we should be looking to hypo subjects, smaller people, as the way forward. And that part of, undoing that type of Titanic, if you will, infrastructure is about a great deal of activity at the sort of hypoactive level, which is both hypo being both sort of lesser and smaller, but also inchoate. So again, sort of resonating with this point about becoming human in a different way. So also there.